Thank you, John. Thank you, John. That's beautiful. Marcus, thank you for reading this morning. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts, may they be acceptable in your sight, O God. You are our rock, our strength, and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, it is really good to see all of you back. Or if this is your first time, welcome. I say this, that it's good to see all of you back because we are now in week 4 of working our way through the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John. And once again, we hear about Jesus as the bread of life. And in some ways, I'm beginning to feel about this chapter the way I feel sometimes at a restaurant where they serve really good bread or rolls before the main dish arrives. And the bread is so good that I end up filling up on the bread and have a very difficult time eating the main dish. And then I say to myself, well, I'll never do that again. But the next time I'm at another restaurant and the bread is so good, I do the same thing again. Have we had enough bread yet? Have we had our fill of Jesus as the bread of life yet? Getting really messy this week, too, as we are stuck in the middle of an argument between Jesus and this crowd who's following him about bread from heaven, and Jesus' rather grotesque assertions about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And since we are not Catholic who believe in transubstantiation, who believe that in the mystery of the act of communion, the bread and wine become the actual body and blood of Christ, these words about flesh and blood may be a bit troubling to us. The big challenge, I think, for me this week, and perhaps all of us, is to answer the question, well, what does this passage have to do with our real life? I mean, seriously, eating Jesus? Now, scholars will tell us contextually that there was this big controversy raging in the late 1st century when this gospel was written. The controversy was about the significance of the Lord's Supper. So John includes a whole chapter of these Jesus sayings in an attempt to settle the dispute. And this week we reach kind of the peak of the discourse about giving his own flesh and blood so that the world might live. Now, from a scholarly point of view, we have the context, but what does it mean spiritually? What does this flesh and blood eating Jesus have to do with our daily living, the ins and outs, the ups and the downs? What does it have to do on those nights that we can't sleep, or the days when getting out of bed takes all of our energy, or when we lose our temper at work, or our children pluck every last nerve, or maybe our parents pluck our every last nerve? Maybe on this day, you and I are more like the crowd, or you are more like the crowd, grumbling a bit. Steve, we are so tired of this flesh stuff. Give us some other food to eat. And I'm with you in the frustration with Jesus' abstract words. The crowd and I think we ask the right question. How can this man give us his flesh? Or in other words, stop talking, Jesus, is nonsense. We need a bit more than your empty sounds, abstract, metaphorical promises. Jesus doesn't give up. And that's the key about God's love, isn't it? Jesus doesn't give up. Look, he says, I'm telling you the truth. Both to the crowd gathered around him in Capernaum and to us, he says, I am telling you the truth. If you do not eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will not have life in yourselves. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. For my flesh is the real food, my blood is the real drink. And he's serious. He's not being metaphorical or speaking abstractly. He really means it. This one, Jesus, would give his flesh to eat and his blood to drink. And I'm glad you're still here. Because it's tempting maybe just to walk out or to shrink back. Because it's gross. When was the last time you really paid close attention to the words of Jesus we remember at the table? Martin Copenhaver, pastor in the United Church of Christ, describes what happened when one of his parishioners did pay attention to the words. He says the communion table was draped, as always, in starched linen and set with silver chalices and plates. The congregation was silent, even somber, as the pastor began carefully to read the words of institution. He says, on this occasion, he writes, when I repeated Jesus' familiar words, this is my body broken for you, this is my blood shed for you, a small girl suddenly, with a loud voice, said, ew, yuck! And the congregation looked horrified. He continues as if someone had splattered blood all over the altar, which in effect is just what the little girl had done with her exclamation. See, in these verses, we begin, I think, to recognize just what is at stake for Jesus. Just how much we are worth to him. In these verses, he offers to us his very own flesh and blood, the flesh which will be stretched upon the cross for our sake, the blood which will flow freely from his hands, feet, and side, also for our sake. For 3 weeks, we have read, studied, and struggled to understand what Jesus means by speaking of the bread and life and food from heaven. Now, in this 4th week, he makes himself far too plain. In this passage, Jesus gets all too gritty in his imagery in order to confront us with the claim and promise of the carnal God, the God who becomes incarnate, who takes on flesh, becomes just like us, so that one day we may become like God. As one scholar writes, for in Jesus the Word made flesh, and in the sacraments the Word given physical, visible form once again, we meet the God who will be satisfied with nothing less than our whole selves. This is why Jesus speaks of giving us flesh and blood, you see, for flesh and blood is a Hebrew idiom which refers to the whole person, hearts, minds, spirits, feelings, hopes, dreams, fears, concerns, everything. Everything. And in Jesus, you see, the whole of God needs us to love, redeem, and sustain the whole of who we are, the good, the bad, and even the ugly. The God who comes for our whole selves. Jesus is the shepherd, we are the sheep. He's the vine, we are the branches. He abides in God, we abide in him. In this passage, Copenhaver continues, language is pressed to the limits to express the indissoluble union and inextricable participation of one life in another. For those who receive Jesus, the whole Jesus, his life clings to our bones and courses through our veins. He can no more be taken from our life than yesterday's breakfast can be plucked from one's body. And this is the promise which God makes to us in the Lord's Supper. To be one with us forever, to stick with us and even in us, no matter what. And because he sticks with us and in us no matter what, I believe we receive 2 things. The first is a promise, and the second is an action. The promise is eternal life. Now, I'll confess to you, I've never been one to focus too much on the eternal life. Maybe I just take it for granted that because I believe in Jesus, I've been given that gift of eternal life. Maybe I just take it for granted. But this week it hit me, and for some reason it hit me hard. See, the one who offers us his flesh and blood is the one who offers us life forever. We can never be separated from this love, this gift, this eternal life. As one of my colleagues posted on Twitter this week, the eternal life is about liberation. The eternal life is about being made whole. The eternal life is about learning that you are loved. This is beyond good news. And maybe we need to take some time to bask in this promise. Eternal life. But at least for me and perhaps for you, I can't bask too long, for there is work to do. And that's the second part, the action. Through this gift and promise of eternal life, we are free. We are free to go about being godlike in our daily living. Free to go and tell others that they are loved. We have a truck to stuff with food. We have marches for justice to attend. We have voices to lift for children still separated from their parents. We have phone calls to make to a church member we haven't seen in a while. We have a card to be sent to someone who is sick. We have a meal to make for someone in need. We have a listening ear to offer to someone who is hurting. And will we mess it up? Oh, sure we will. We'll say the wrong thing. We might step on a few toes. But we persist. Because we have the promise that God not only cares about our births, our deaths, our marriages, our jobs, our successes, and our failures, but that God has joined God's own self to them, to us, through Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh and given for us. And friends, in these days, in these times, this promise of eternal life and our need and persisting need to act, this Jesus, this meal, I think is worth sharing.